It was March 14th, 1989. 4:17 inches the afternoon. The fluorescent lights of a Walmart supercenter in Falls Church, Virginia, reflected off polished linoleum floors and shelves stacked with Easter candy. To every customer that day, it was just another Wednesday, just another trip to pick up milk, bread, maybe motor oil for the car. But to the 12 FBI agents scattered throughout the aisles disguised as shoppers, clerks, and managers, this was the end of a 7-year hunt. A middle-aged man in a beige windbreaker pushed an empty cart through the automatic doors. He looked ordinary. Khaki pants, wire-rimmed glasses, quiet, polite, the kind of face that disappears into the crowd. His name, according to his driver's license, was Michael Vernon. But that name was a lie. His real name was Viktor Mikhailovich Chernov, one of the most successful Soviet illegals ever to operate on American soil. For years, he had lived among them, blending in, laughing at office jokes, volunteering at a community center, sharing beers with engineers who had no idea they were revealing secrets to Moscow. He had passed information that shaped Soviet understanding of America's defenses, of its satellites, its weapons, its counterintelligence network. And now, he was here. Chernov moved calmly past the aisles, automotive, groceries, toiletries, unaware that every step, every breath, every nervous glance was being watched through hidden earpieces and mirrored sunglasses. The operations command post was set up in the back office behind the photo counter. There, Special Agent Thomas Brennan waited for one phrase over the radio: "He's moving." When Chernov reached the rear of the store and pushed open the door to the men's restroom, Brennan gave the signal. 3 minutes later, the door opened again. Chernov walked out, carrying a plain Walmart bag inside it, a small waterproof container that held a passport, $5,000, and a plan to disappear forever. He almost made it to the exit. Almost. "Michael Vernon," Brennan said quietly, stepping into his path, "or whoever you are, FBI, you need to come with us." End quote. And in that instant, between the aisles of milk and motor oil, one of the most secret wars of the Cold War finally came to an end. The story of Viktor Mikhailovich Chernov did not begin in that Walmart aisle. It began 7 years earlier, in the early 1982, in the shadowed offices of the KGB's Directorate S, Moscow. This was the division responsible for illegals, deep cover agents sent abroad without diplomatic immunity, built entirely on fabricated identities. They lived as Americans, not spies, no embassy protection, no official ties to the Soviet Union. If they were caught, the Kremlin would deny they ever existed. Viktor Chernov was one of their finest. Patient, intelligent, methodical to the point of obsession. He was trained to build a life that could withstand scrutiny, a life so ordinary, so believable, that no one would ever look twice. His cover identity, Michael Vernon, was based on a real man, an American from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, who had died in a car crash in 1973. The KGB had quietly resurrected him. They forged tax records, employment history, even a marriage certificate from a short-lived union that supposedly ended in 1978. To the U.S. government, Michael Vernon had never died. He had simply grown older, moved east, and taken up technical consulting work. Chernov entered the United States in 1982 under that name. He rented a modest townhouse in Arlington, Virginia, a short drive from the Pentagon and countless defense contractors. He joined a local Rotary Club, donated to charity events, and smiled for neighborhood barbecues. To everyone who met him, he was pleasant, polite, even helpful, the kind of man who lent jumper cables or fixed a neighbor's broken light. No one suspected that behind the friendly eyes was a KGB officer gathering fragments of America's most guarded secrets. His method was simple. He never stole anything directly. He didn't break into safes or hack into systems. Instead, he listened. Over lunches and after-work drinks, engineers complained about projects, mentioned problems, or shared small technical details they shouldn't have. To them, it was harmless conversation. To Chernov, it was raw intelligence. Piece by piece, he built a mosaic of weapons systems, satellite programs, counterintelligence operations. He was an artist of aggregation, transforming gossip into strategy. By 1985, his reports sent to Moscow through dead drops hidden in hollow bricks, park benches, or magnetized boxes under bridges had earned him a reputation inside the KGB as a ghost, an illegal so deeply buried that even American counterintelligence barely knew he existed. Yet ghosts, no matter how careful, always leave traces. Before that day in March 1989, before the fluorescent lights and the handcuffs, Viktor Mikhailovich Chernov was invisible. He was what the KGB called an illegal, a deep-cover operative who lived not under diplomatic immunity or embassy protection, but entirely inside an invented life. For 7 years, he had existed behind the mask of an American man who never truly existed, Michael Vernon. Born in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, an engineer who had drifted through the Midwest, working for small defense contractors, divorced once, quiet, reliable. The story, the legend, was flawless. The Soviets had built it brick by brick. They had resurrected the identity of a real Michael Vernon, a young man who had died in a car crash in 1973 and then aged him forward on paper. They created tax records, school transcripts, even a marriage license that ended in a divorce no one would ever question. By the time Chernov arrived in the United States in 1982, the identity was unbreakable. He settled in Arlington, Virginia, in a modest townhouse painted beige, identical to 100 others on the street. He paid bills on time. He smiled to neighbors. He mowed his lawn on Saturdays. He volunteered once a month at a local community center and joined the Rotary Club. When asked about his past, he said he'd moved east for better work. Nobody doubted him. He was the embodiment of suburban anonymity, and that was precisely the point. Unlike some Soviet illegals who kept to themselves and drew suspicion, Chernov blended. He went to barbecues, chatted about baseball, dated occasionally but never seriously. His accent was perfect, his habits unremarkable. To his colleagues, he was Mike from Systems, a soft-spoken technical consultant who could solve any circuit problem, who knew which projects were hitting delays and which engineers were frustrated about funding cuts. He never asked for classified files. He didn't need to. He listened. He collected fragments. Over lunches and late-night projects, he learned how much could be gleaned from casual conversation. An engineer complaining about material shortages, a manager hinting at radar calibration issues, a memo accidentally left on a copier. Piece by piece, Chernov assembled the puzzle and sent it home to Moscow. He used no radios, no microtransmitters, no contact with the Soviet embassy. Instead, he relied on an ancient tradecraft that had survived centuries. Dead drops, packages of film or notes hidden in hollow bricks, magnetic boxes fixed to the underside of park benches, coffee cans buried beneath the roots of trees in Rock Creek Park. Each drop would be collected by someone who never knew the sender's name. A courier, a tourist, a friend of a friend. Even if one was caught, the chain would not lead back to him. His intelligence reports, coded, precise, and remarkably accurate, became legendary within the KGB's first chief directorate. They called him Prospect, the Avenue. He had mapped the structure of U.S. defense contracting networks, identified weaknesses in electronic warfare systems, and even revealed operational patterns of American counterintelligence, all without ever stepping into a classified vault. And through it all, he seemed utterly normal. Neighbors would later tell FBI investigators he was helpful, the kind of guy who'd lend you a wrench or help jumpstart your car. But now that I think of it, we didn't really know him at all. His ability to sustain that illusion, to live every hour as someone else, demanded more than discipline. It demanded faith. Faith that the KGB still needed him. Faith that the Soviet Union, an ocean away, would remember him. In reality, Chernov's isolation was profound. He couldn't confide in anyone. He couldn't relax. Every friendship had an expiration date. Every conversation was a performance. To maintain emotional stability, he followed small rituals. Every Sunday at 3, he drove to Walmart, bought the same groceries, and returned home. The predictability soothed him, a fragile anchor in a fabricated life. By the late 1982, the Cold War was shifting. Reagan and Gorbachev were signing treaties. Glasnost and Perestroika were reshaping the Soviet system, but espionage continued as if nothing had changed. In the quiet suburbs of Virginia, Viktor Chernov was still serving a country that was beginning to question itself. At Langley, however, analysts were noticing patterns, documents missing from secure facilities, communications intercepted too often to be coincidence, American agents in Eastern Europe suddenly compromised. The conclusion was inescapable. There was a leak, and it was deep. When the first KGB defector came forward in 1985 and mentioned a Soviet illegal in the Washington area, the CIA and FBI began one of the largest joint counterintelligence efforts in U.S. history. The defector didn't know a name, only that the spy's code name was Prospect, and that his reports were technically brilliant. The search dragged on for years. Thousands of documents were reviewed, hundreds of employees vetted, but the invisible man left no trace. Until one analyst, Catherine Reeves, a young FBI specialist with a reputation for seeing patterns others missed, asked a simple question: what if he's hiding in plain sight? She studied not anomalies, but routines, church attendance, gym visits, grocery runs, the normalization rituals used by illegals to blend in. When she cross-referenced defense contractors' employee lists with people who had consistent, almost mechanical habits, one name appeared: Michael Vernon. On paper, he was flawless, too flawless. A life with no financial irregularities, no foreign travel, no family connections. But when investigators checked deeper, they found hairline cracks, a college that had no record of his attendance, a company that listed him on payroll but couldn't find his personnel file, a reference letter signed by someone who didn't remember him. Individually, each discrepancy meant nothing. Together, they whispered one thing: fabrication. By early 1988, the FBI had him under constant surveillance. They watched him go to work, come home, live a perfectly boring life, except for that one unchanging ritual, the Sunday trip to Walmart. To most agents, it was meaningless. But Reeves saw something else, a pattern that was too perfect. Maybe, she thought, this wasn't just shopping. Maybe this was normalization, the routine a spy uses to convince himself he's still human. And that's where they began to wait. Week after week, month after month. While Chernov filled his cart with milk, bread, soup, and soap, the FBI filled notebooks with times, patterns, behaviors. For nearly a year, they watched the quietest man in Virginia, waiting for the moment he would make a single mistake. What they didn't know was that the man they called Michael Vernon had already begun to sense the net closing around him. He just didn't know how close it had gotten. It began, as many Cold War counterintelligence stories did, with a whisper from the other side. In the summer of 1985, an exhausted KGB officer walked into an American diplomatic outpost in Western Europe and quietly asked for asylum. His name would never be made public, but during his debriefing, across dozens of nights in a safe house outside Frankfurt, he mentioned something that made CIA officers sit up straighter. He spoke of an illegal, a deep-cover Soviet operative in the Washington, D.C. area. The man's code name, he said, was Prospect, the Avenue. He didn't know the agent's real name or appearance, but he had read fragments of reports attributed to him. They were meticulous, filled with details about U.S. radar programs, electronic warfare research, and classified military contracts. Whoever Prospect was, he wasn't an embassy officer or short-term visitor. He was someone with long-term access, someone living among Americans, unnoticed. At Langley and at the J. Edgar Hoover building, alarm bells rang. If what the defector said was true, then Moscow's center had managed to plant a ghost inside the very heart of America's defense industry. That was how Operation Silent Thunder was born, one of the most painstaking and quietly obsessive investigations in FBI history. At first, The scope seemed overwhelming. Tens of thousands of people held security clearances in the greater DC area. Engineers, contractors, analysts, any one of them could be the source of the leak. The Bureau began by combing through years of internal losses, classified documents that had gone missing, intercepted transmissions that hinted at compromised channels, agents in Eastern Europe who had been exposed and arrested. Analysts built massive matrices of connections, trying to find a pattern. They found nothing because Prospect had built his career around not leaving any. The turning point came in late 1987 from an unlikely source. A Soviet intelligence officer named Valery Yenko, who had defected to the West and then bizarrely redefected back to the u.s.s.r, left behind a few crucial statements during his first debriefing. In one of them, he described something that caught the FBI's attention, a behavioral tactic used by Soviet illegals called normalization rituals. These were small, repetitive acts, weekly errands, social clubs, predictable routines designed not only to make an agent appear ordinary, but to give him psychological stability. Illegals lived under constant tension. The rituals kept them sane, believable, and invisible. When this note reached the FBI's counterintelligence division, Catherine Reeves, the same analyst who had been piecing together fragments of Prospect's reports, took special interest. She began to think differently. Maybe the Bureau was looking for the wrong anomalies. Maybe the leak wasn't hiding through chaos, but through order. So she shifted her focus from what people did wrong to what they did too perfectly right. Reeves built a new database, names of people with technical access to defense information, cross-referenced with routine personal behavior, gym visits, credit card purchases, grocery trips, church attendance. Most people's lives were messy, inconsistent, but one profile stood out like a perfectly drawn line. Michael Vernon, a mid-level consultant who had moved across multiple defense firms, always in low-level but well-connected roles. Reeves requested a background check. What came back looked clean, almost suspiciously so. No traffic tickets, no missed taxes, no medical debts, no surviving relatives. He had no digital fingerprints outside his supposed career. His entire existence before 1975 was supported by paper, not people. So the Bureau dug deeper. A university registrar said his transcript listed courses that didn't exist. A former employer had pay stubs with his name, but no personnel record. A reference listed on his resume was dead. The address led to an empty lot. Each inconsistency, by itself, was trivial. But Reeves looked at them like a mathematician, not as separate points, but as a constellation. And in that constellation, she saw a shadow. By January 1988, Michael Vernon was under full surveillance. Teams followed him everywhere, from his Arlington townhouse, to his gym, to his workplace, and most importantly, to the Walmart Supercenter in Falls Church, which he visited every Sunday at 3:00 p.m. sharp. At first, the visit seemed benign. He bought groceries, always in cash, never using coupons or credit. He walked the aisles calmly, nodding to cashiers he seemed to recognize, but never truly engaged with. His predictability was almost hypnotic. But in counterintelligence, predictability is never ignored. It's either innocence or a code. For months, the FBI logged every item he purchased, every route he took, every minute he lingered in the aisles. They noticed something uncanny. He always parked in roughly the same spot, used the same entrance, spent the same amount of time in the store. Even the order of his shopping seemed rehearsed. To Reeves, it looked like ritual. To others, it looked like cover. Still, none of this was enough for an arrest. To charge espionage, they needed proof of actual intelligence activity, a handoff, a coded signal, a hidden device. So, the Bureau waited. And while they waited, they watched Prospect begin to unravel. By mid-1988, Chernov's awareness of surveillance had grown. He began checking his mirrors more often. He varied his routes to work. Sometimes, he'd stop his car abruptly, pretending to look for directions, a classic surveillance detection maneuver. The FBI noticed, but didn't press. They wanted him to feel the pressure, not panic. Then, quietly, they began to close the circle. Cars lingered a bit too long behind him. A familiar face appeared twice in the same cafe. Subtle cues that any trained operative would recognize as a warning. You're being watched. The Bureau hoped that fear would drive him to activate his emergency protocols, to signal his handlers, to access his hidden network, to make the mistake they needed. He didn't, not yet. Through the autumn of 1988 and into the winter of 1989, the operation stretched on. Reeves spent nights poring over satellite intercepts and coded transmissions. Field agents sat in parked cars, drinking bad coffee, staring at supermarket entrances. Then, one night, in early March, a flicker appeared on an NSA intercept, a fragment of a coded message from Moscow Center mentioning a contingency meeting in the Falls Church area March 14th, late afternoon. The code referred to Prospect. For the first time in 7 years, the FBI had a date, a place, and a chance. The director approved full mobilization. Dozens of agents were assigned to the operation. Surveillance vans moved into position. The store's management was quietly briefed. The order was simple: observe. Do not engage until proof of espionage is clear. Capture if contact is attempted. And so, on that gray Wednesday in March 1989, as ordinary shoppers pushed their carts through aisles of detergent and cereal, the most patient man in Soviet intelligence walked once more into his weekly ritual, unaware that it would be his last. By the spring of 1988, Viktor Chernov's life had become a theater performance that even he was beginning to forget the script for. Every gesture, every polite smile, every perfectly timed grocery trip, all of it had to be sustained without faltering. Because one misstep could mean exposure, arrest, or worse. The FBI, meanwhile, had turned his quiet suburban routine into a battlefield of patience. Operation Silent Thunder now spanned 3 field offices and more than 60 agents. They worked in rotating teams, swapping vehicles and disguises so as not to arouse suspicion. Some followed him to work, others monitored his mailbox, still others sifted through his trash late at night, searching for a clue that might connect Michael Vernon to a world beyond Virginia. But Victor left nothing behind. His garbage contained nothing incriminating, only coffee grounds, newspapers, and receipts for perfectly ordinary groceries. His phone calls were brief, mundane. His bank account never fluctuated beyond what his salary could justify. He was the embodiment of statistical normalcy. To his neighbors, he was simply a quiet bachelor who spent too much time alone. To the FBI, he was a void in human form, a man who moved through society without leaving the traces that ordinary people did. Each Sunday, at exactly 3 p.m., the same car, a tan Honda Accord, rolled out of his driveway. He drove the same route, took the same parking spot, and spent roughly 55 minutes inside the Walmart supercenter at Falls Church. Inside, hidden among racks of clothing and displays of detergent, the FBI had stationed agents disguised as store employees. One pretended to mop floors, another restocked shelves near the automotive section. 2 more worked the photo counter. They watched him push his cart in a slow, looping circuit through the aisles, dairy, bakery, cleaning supplies, then automotive. Every week, without variation, it was eerie in its precision. And yet, as weeks turned into months, nothing happened. No coded exchange, no hidden signal, no contact. Some agents began to doubt that this was their man. Maybe he was just another eccentric engineer with obsessive habits, but Catherine Reeves insisted. Routine, she said, is never routine for an illegal. It's structure. It's the only thing keeping him sane. She was right about that. For Viktor Chernov, his rituals were not camouflage, they were survival. Years of isolation had taught him that control over the smallest details of his day could prevent him from collapsing under the weight of a double life. By mid-1988, the FBI's patience began to thin. The Bureau had spent nearly 3 years and millions of dollars chasing an invisible adversary. The leadership wanted progress, evidence, movement, a confession, something. So they changed tactics. Instead of staying invisible, they decided to let Chernov feel the hunt. It began with small intrusions. A familiar sedan appeared twice in his rear-view mirror on the same day. A man he had seen once at his gym showed up again at a nearby diner. A phone call at work ended with a faint click just long enough for a paranoid mind to notice. To most people, such coincidences would mean nothing, but to a trained KGB officer, they were unmistakable. The Americans were closing in. Inside his townhouse, Chernov grew increasingly restless. He started taking alternate routes to work, using public transportation on random days, and varying the times he left home. He bought a new lock for his front door and changed the placement of his furniture, subtle checks to see if anyone had entered while he was gone. He was slipping from calm control into a slow, grinding paranoia. Yet even under stress, his tradecraft held. He never reached out to the Soviet embassy. He never attempted to contact another agent. He never made a mistake that could expose his network. The FBI admired his discipline and hated it. For Catherine Reeves and her colleagues, the investigation became an exercise in endurance. Each report from the field looked the same. Subject observed, leaving residence at 0745 hours, drove to work. No anomalies. Subject returned home at 1810 hours. Watched television, no anomalies. It was as though they were surveilling a ghost. One night, Reeves stayed late at headquarters, staring at months of data pinned to the walls, maps, photographs, timelines. The pattern was perfect, too perfect. What if the act of not doing anything is his communication? She asked aloud to the empty room. Her theory was that Chernov might be signaling Moscow through absence. No dead drops, no contacts, no anomalies, a code meaning safe, secure, no changes. If she was right, the only way to flush him out was to make him unsafe. So she proposed a campaign of psychological compression. The FBI would keep the surveillance visible just enough to make him nervous, to trigger an emergency response. The Bureau approved. It began with the parking lot. Agents let him see a man taking photographs of cars 2 rows away. Another followed him openly for several blocks before turning off. A neighbor he had barely spoken to in reality, an undercover agent, began greeting him too warmly, too often. Every move said, "We see you." Weeks passed. Chernov's nerves frayed further. He began scanning faces in crowds, pausing before opening his mailbox, hesitating before starting his car. But the FBI's biggest fear was also their only hope, that he would try to run. They knew he had to have an emergency plan every illegal did. A cache of money, forged documents, a route out. But where? Surveillance teams combed every park and parking lot he visited, checking walls, benches, and bricks for hidden compartments. They found nothing. Chernov, it seemed, had hidden his escape route too well. Then came March 1989. In a nondescript listening post in suburban Maryland, an NSA operator intercepted a coded burst transmission, a pattern recognized as Soviet. Analysts decrypted fragments. Among them was a date and a place, embedded in the cipher's timing. Falls Church, March 14th. Reeves didn't need to be told twice. She knew where he'd be. The Walmart. For months, that store had been the epicenter of his carefully built normality. If he needed to retrieve an emergency package, if he needed cover for a clandestine act, that was where he'd go. On the morning of March 14th, the Operations Command Center was established inside the Walmart stockroom. Dozens of agents arrived in staggered shifts, dressed as customers, clerks, delivery staff. Store management was briefed under a strict non-disclosure order. Even the security cameras were redirected to prevent footage leaks. At 3:45 p.m., Chernov's car pulled out of his driveway, not on his usual Sunday, but a Wednesday. The timing confirmed it. Something extraordinary was about to happen. As he parked and stepped through the automatic doors at 4:17 p.m., Hidden microphones captured the mechanical click of his shopping cart wheels. Agents took positions. Thomas Brennan, the case supervisor, adjusted his earpiece and whispered the command, "Silent Thunder is active." For the next 30 minutes, Chernov moved through the store as he always had, or almost. He was tenser now, his eyes scanning reflections in the glass freezer doors, his hands shaking slightly as he picked up a can of soup. When he reached the automotive section, he lingered. He picked up a bottle of motor oil, examined it, replaced it, then another and another. Reeves, monitoring from the back office, leaned forward. "He's doing counter-surveillance checks," she murmured. To the untrained eye, it looked like browsing. To the FBI, it was a man searching for watches. After several minutes, Chernov left his cart by a display of paper towels and walked toward the restrooms at the rear of the store. That was the moment Brennan had been waiting for. He spoke into his mic, "All units, eyes on. He's moving." 2 agents positioned themselves near the restroom door. Others blocked potential exits. Inside the tiled room, the fluorescent hum echoed against cold walls. Chernov entered the 3rd stall farthest from the door and locked it. Then, silence. 3 minutes passed. What he did in that time would not be fully understood until later, when the FBI dismantled the stall's plumbing panel and found the small, waterproof container hidden behind it. Inside, a forged Canadian passport, $5,000 in cash, and a handwritten list of emergency safe houses stretching from Virginia to the Canadian border. It was his escape kit, the last line of defense for a man who had lived a lie too long. When the door opened again, Chernov walked out with the calm of a man who knew his life was collapsing. He placed the container into a plastic Walmart bag and pushed his cart toward the front of the store. He didn't make it far. 30 feet from the exit, Special Agent Thomas Brennan stepped forward. "Michael Vernon, or whoever you are," he said quietly. "FBI, you need to come with us." Chernov froze. His shoulders fell. Witnesses would later say he looked almost relieved. He didn't resist. He didn't run. He simply whispered, "I want to speak to an attorney." In that moment, 7 years of invisible war ended not with gunfire or chase, but with a single, exhausted sigh under the fluorescent glow of a Walmart. The arrest itself lasted less than 30 seconds. But for the FBI agents who had waited 7 years, it felt like the longest half-minute of their careers. As the handcuffs clicked shut around Viktor Chernov's wrists, shoppers stopped mid-step. Some thought it was a shoplifter being caught. Others just moved on, unaware they were witnessing the end of one of the most sophisticated espionage operations of the Cold War. Chernov didn't struggle. His breathing was steady. To the agents escorting him out of the store, his silence was almost unnerving, not defiance, not fear, but acceptance. As if he had always known it would end this way. Outside, the parking lot had been cleared. The late afternoon light cut across the asphalt as agents guided him into an unmarked sedan. From the moment the door closed, Operation Silent Thunder was over. At FBI headquarters, the mood was triumphant but tense. They had captured a Soviet illegal on U.S. soil, something that almost never happened. But the elation quickly gave way to a colder reality. What now? Without direct evidence of espionage, a handoff, a transmission, or classified documents in his possession, prosecuting him would be nearly impossible. Chernov had been caught retrieving an escape kit, not passing secrets. Under U.S. law, that distinction mattered. Nevertheless, the Bureau treated him as one of the most valuable catches in decades. He was transferred to a secure facility at Quantico, placed in an isolation cell, and interrogated by teams from both the FBI and the CIA. But Viktor Chernov, or Michael Vernon, as he continued to identify himself, said almost nothing. "I want to speak to an attorney," were his only words during the first 48 hours. For days, agents tried everything: the good cop routine, the patient silence, the appeals to logic. "You know the Soviet Union is changing. You could start over here." But Chernov's composure never broke. The man they had spent years chasing had turned into a wall of quiet professionalism. He was trained to wait us out, one interrogator later recalled, and he knew exactly how to do it. They found fingerprints on the waterproof container that matched none in US databases. But when compared through liaison channels with Soviet records quietly obtained from a friendly Eastern European service, the prints confirmed what the Bureau already suspected. The man they had arrested was Viktor Mikhailovich Chernov, born in Minsk, 1944. Formerly attached to the KGB's first Chief Directorate, Department S, the division responsible for illegals. The FBI had its man, but not his cooperation. By law, the Bureau had to charge him with something or release him. The Department of Justice drafted an indictment under espionage statutes, but without hard proof of a transmission or a recipient, it risked collapsing in court. The CIA argued for secrecy. "Don't put him on trial," one internal memo read. "Use him." To Langley, Chernov was not a criminal, he was currency, because somewhere behind the Iron Curtain, there was an American sitting in a cell. That person's name remains classified to this day. All that is known is that the officer, male or female, had been captured in Eastern Europe in 1986 while on assignment for the CIA. Repeated attempts to secure their release had failed. The Soviets denied even holding them. Until now, within 2 weeks of Chernov's arrest, carefully worded messages began appearing through diplomatic back channels. Soviet officials, while publicly denying any knowledge of a man named Viktor Chernov, privately inquired whether the United States might be open to a humanitarian exchange. It was the old language of the spy trade. The U.S. State Department forwarded the proposal to the White House. President George H.W. Bush had just taken office, inheriting a cautious détente with Mikhail Gorbachev's reforming Soviet government. The last thing he wanted was a high-profile espionage trial that could derail fragile negotiations on arms reduction. Behind closed doors, an uneasy consensus formed. A swap might be the cleanest solution, but not everyone agreed. At the FBI, the counterintelligence division was furious. They had spent 7 years tracking this ghost. And now, just as they had him in custody, the idea of sending him home felt like erasing everything. Special Agent Thomas Brennan argued passionately against it. "We need to show the Soviets that we can catch their best," he said. "We can't keep trading them back like baseball cards." Catherine Reeves disagreed. "The Bureau's job is to protect American lives," she told her superior quietly. "If one of ours comes home because of him, that's a win." In the end, it wasn't their decision. The choice would come from the Oval Office. Negotiations were conducted through intelligence channels rather than public diplomacy. The CIA handled most of it, quiet meetings in neutral cities, coded cables, and discreet flights to Vienna and Helsinki. The terms were clear. The Soviets would release the captured American operative in exchange for the return of Viktor Chernov. Verification became the sticking point. Each side demanded proof that the prisoner on offer was alive and authentic. Both intelligence agencies were wary of deception. More than one Cold War swap had nearly gone wrong because of last-minute betrayals. As months passed, Chernov remained in federal custody calm, courteous, unreadable. His attorneys, paid quietly by Soviet diplomatic intermediaries, filed procedural motions but never challenged his identity. He never asked about the negotiations, never reacted to the rumors swirling around him. When questioned, he simply said, "I will go where I am sent." On the 7th of October 1989, under the cover of a routine diplomatic flight, Chernov was transported from his holding cell to Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington. He was given plain clothes, a medical check, and a brief meeting with 2 CIA officers who had overseen his case. "You could stay," one of them told him. "Defect, start over, no one would know." Chernov looked at the man and smiled faintly. "I already started over once," he said. "That's enough." The plane lifted off at dawn, bound for Vienna. At the same time, another aircraft, this one Soviet, took off from Moscow, carrying a single passenger, the American operative who had been missing for 3 years. The exchange took place not at Checkpoint Charlie, as in the old days, but in a nondescript conference room at a hotel near Vienna's airport. The setting was deliberately mundane, no press, no spectacle. Representatives from both sides entered the room from opposite doors. Chernov stood tall, wearing a gray suit provided by his captors. Across from him, the American, gaunt, pale, but alive, met his eyes briefly. A pair of officers on each side confirmed identities, documents, and health status. There was no handshake, no words exchanged. Then, silently, the two prisoners walked past each other. 15 minutes later, both were gone. Chernov boarded a Soviet diplomatic plane and disappeared into the cloud cover eastward. The American operative was flown to Ramstein Air Base in West Germany, then on to Washington for debriefing. When Viktor Chernov stepped off the plane in Moscow, the Cold War was weeks away from collapsing. The Berlin Wall would fall in November. The Soviet Union itself would dissolve 2 years later. But for the moment, he was welcomed as a hero. The KGB awarded him a medal for service abroad under exceptional circumstances. He was granted an apartment in central Moscow and a quiet administrative position within the intelligence bureaucracy. And then he vanished. After 1991, when the KGB fractured into successor agencies, Chernov's name disappeared from public records. Journalists and intelligence historians later tried to find him. Some claimed he had retired in St. Petersburg, others that he died quietly in the early 2000s. None of it was ever confirmed. Back in Washington, the FBI filed its final report on Operation Silent Thunder. It was both victory and frustration. They had proven that even the best Soviet illegals could be found, but they had never truly caught him in the act. Still, within the Bureau, the story became legend. New recruits were told the tale of the man who shopped for groceries every Sunday while carrying the secrets of 2 superpowers in his head. Reeves went on to receive a commendation for her analytical work. Brennan retired a few years later, still convinced they had let Chernov go too easily. Yet, privately, he admitted that the operation had changed him. "You think espionage is about chases and codes," he told a colleague once. "But really, it's about patience and knowing when a man's silence says more than his words ever could." As for the American traded for Chernov, their identity remains classified even decades later. The CIA confirmed only that the officer survived, returned, and resumed limited service. Families of missing intelligence officers from that era have long speculated, but the truth remains sealed. The agency has maintained a permanent cover status on the case, the highest level of secrecy it can grant. For them, the swap was a quiet success. For the FBI, it was an unfinished story. In hindsight, Chernov's capture came at the twilight of an age. Within months, the Berlin Wall would crumble, the Warsaw Pact would dissolve, and the very empire he had served would cease to exist. What had all those years of lies and coded messages been for? No one knows what Chernov thought as he watched his homeland transform from a global superpower into a fading memory. Some say he felt pride, others believe regret. Perhaps, in the long hours of his quiet Moscow apartment, he replayed that final walk through Walmart, the sterile light, the echo of his footsteps, the 30 feet he didn't cross. He had outwitted the FBI for 7 years, yet it was his own need for control, his devotion to ritual, that finally betrayed him. In the end, the smallest habit, a weekly grocery trip, became the thread that unraveled an entire secret life. And maybe that is the cruel irony of espionage, that after years spent mastering deception, a man can be undone not by betrayal or technology, but by his own humanity, the need for routine, the desire to feel normal, even while living a lie. The story of Viktor Chernov might have ended in that Vienna hotel room, with 2 spies passing each other in silence, but espionage stories rarely end cleanly. They linger. They echo through the institutions that waged them and the people who survived them. When the Berlin Wall fell just a month after his release, many inside the American intelligence community saw it as a poetic conclusion. The Cold War's final trade, completed on the eve of history's turning point. But inside the FBI's counterintelligence division, there was no sense of closure. Operation Silent Thunder had exposed just how deeply and quietly Moscow's intelligence services could infiltrate American life and how ordinary that infiltration could look. For Catherine Reeves, it became a case study she taught to young agents for years. Her lesson was simple: the enemy doesn't hide in the shadows anymore. He hides in plain sight, mowing his lawn, paying his taxes, shopping for milk. In Moscow, Chernov's return made only a small ripple in public records, but a large one inside the KGB. He was honored, briefly, as a loyal son of the motherland. Then, he was quietly reassigned. The Soviet Union in 1989 was a state in freefall, its economy collapsing, its ideology eroding. The KGB's own ranks were fracturing, old loyalties were dissolving. For a time, Chernov served as a consultant within the intelligence archives, reviewing Western case studies and advising new recruits on how to build legends, false identities. But as the political system crumbled, his expertise became less relevant. By the time the u.s.s.r. dissolved in December 1991, Chernov had already retired. Some journalists later claimed to have found him in a grey apartment block in St. Petersburg, an old man who still spoke perfect English, who still kept his groceries organized alphabetically in his kitchen, and who still went for walks at precisely 3 p.m. every Sunday. Whether that man truly was Viktor Chernov, no one could confirm. Others believed he had died quietly in the early 2000s. Moscow's intelligence archives remained silent on the matter. After his swap, the CIA and FBI jointly compiled what became known as the Chernov Report, a classified document assessing the extent of the information he had stolen or reconstructed. It was, by all accounts, staggering. Through fragments gathered from open conversations, unclassified papers, and social relationships, Chernov had mapped more than 40 defense and intelligence programs, early stealth research, satellite imaging calibration, electronic warfare testing, even operational details about U.S. counterintelligence protocols. He had never touched a classified file, yet through inference and analysis, the art of aggregation, he had built a picture of American capability that rivaled what a top-level mole might have provided. One former CIA officer, years after retirement, described it bluntly: he didn't need to steal secrets, he built them out of thin air. Still, the agency's official damage assessment downplayed his impact. They argued that while his intelligence was technically impressive, it did not change the strategic balance of the Cold War. The US still retained technological superiority. The Soviets were already on the brink of collapse. But others disagreed. Analysts from both sides later suggested that Chernov's intelligence had allowed Moscow to allocate military resources more effectively in the 1,980 seconds, prolonging the life of a dying empire, if only slightly. And in espionage, even slight advantages matter. For the FBI, the case became a parable about patience. In training briefings, new agents still hear the line, 7 years of work for 30 feet of truth. The story taught them that modern espionage isn't a world of high-speed chases or glamorous infiltrations. It's a world of slow observation of analysts like Catherine Reeves staring at data for months until they see a pattern nobody else does. It also became a warning. For every Chernov they caught, there might be others still living ordinary American lives, teaching at universities, running small businesses, working inside companies that build the next generation of technology. Reeves, when asked years later if she believed there were more Chernovs, answered simply, "There always are. They just change their flags." The Walmart in Falls Church, Virginia, has been remodeled several times since 1989. The restrooms have been renovated. The stall where Chernov retrieved his escape kit was replaced years ago. Shoppers still walk the same aisles, unaware that under their feet lies the site of one of the most successful counterintelligence operations of the Cold War. The FBI never installed a plaque. They never tell the store's employees what happened there. But among agents, it's a place of quiet myth, a reminder that the front lines of espionage aren't in foreign capitals, but in the most ordinary corners of America. As one retired agent put it, people think spies are caught in back alleys or embassies, but sometimes they're caught between aisles of motor oil and paper towels. If there is tragedy in Viktor Chernov's story, it lies in its irony. He was, by all accounts, a man who believed deeply in duty to his homeland, to the cause he was trained for. But when the Soviet Union he served dissolved, that loyalty evaporated into history. The state he risked everything for simply ceased to exist. All that remained was the routine, the Sunday rituals, the invisible life he had built so perfectly that it became real to him. Perhaps, in his final years, Chernov understood the futility of it all, that in a war fought through secrets, even the victors are forgotten. Today, decades later, the FBI and CIA still cite Operation Silent Thunder as a benchmark of interagency cooperation. The methodologies developed during the case data pattern analysis, behavioral surveillance, psychological compression have since become standard tools for identifying deep cover operatives in the United States. In 2010, when a network of Russian illegals was uncovered in New York and Boston, older agents whispered that it felt like a ghost from the past Chernov's children. The techniques were eerily similar: long-term legends, no embassy ties, American jobs, quiet, suburban lives. History, it seemed, was repeating itself. If Viktor Chernov is alive today, he would be in his 80s, an old man walking the grey streets of a country that no longer resembles the one he once served. Perhaps he still checks over his shoulder before crossing the road. Perhaps he still keeps his cupboards organized like a man afraid of losing control. He might even still dream of that moment, March 14th, 1989, when the automatic doors of Walmart slid open, and for 3 minutes he held his freedom in his hands. 3 minutes in a bathroom stall, 30 feet to the exit. That was the distance between a life reclaimed and a life erased. No one will ever know if he regretted retrieving that escape kit, or if part of him wanted to be caught to finally stop pretending. Because in the end, the greatest prison for a spy isn't the cell or the interrogation room. It's the life he builds to hide himself, a life so convincing that even he forgets it's a lie. And so, under the soft hum of Walmart's fluorescent lights, one man's secret war ended quietly, leaving behind a lesson written not in gunfire or betrayal, but in silence, patience, and the ordinariness of evil. This story, like every story of our modern world, doesn't end here. If you found this analysis meaningful, please leave a like, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share your thoughts below. What do you think happened to Viktor Chernov after 1989? See you in the next Cold War story.